Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time I finished the Battle of Ezra Church, which blunted but didn't completely stop William T. Sherman's push along the western boundary of the city of Atlanta. Now Sherman launches another attempt to cut the supply lines coming into the city. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, or purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Following the Battle of Ezra Church, William T. Sherman still needed to cut the Atlanta and West Point Railroad and the Macon and Western Railroad that ran from the west into the city of Atlanta. But the Confederate Army commander John Bell Hood knew that would be one of Sherman's targets and used Stephen D. Lee's corps to occupy a line running out of the city to the southwest toward East Point. Sherman kept Oliver Otis Howard's Army of the Tennessee basically where it was around Ezra Church, with the Army of the Cumberland occupying an area to the northwest and north of the city. Previous to this planned movement, Sherman sent his cavalry on a raid to destroy parts of the railroad, but those ended in disaster. So now he would move John Schofield's 23rd Corps of the Army of the Ohio and the 14th Corps under John Palmer from the Army of the Cumberland to strike at that railroad. However, there was a problem. Both Palmer and Schofield held their rank from the same date in November 1862. Palmer believed that Schofield was junior to him and refused to take orders from Schofield, even though Sherman, the Army Group commander, declared Schofield the senior in rank. Sherman did this on August 5th, and that's when Palmer was told to take orders from Schofield. He officially handed in his resignation and went home to Illinois. His replacement will be a division commander within the 14th Corps with an unfortunate name for a Union general, Jefferson C. Davis. Davis was born in Indiana and joined the military during the Mexican-American War. After the war, he stayed in the Army, being transferred around the country. He was stationed at Fort Moultrie and then Fort Sumter when that fort was fired on by Confederate forces beginning the Civil War. He spent time in the Trans-Mississippi Department, then was transferred to Kentucky where he served under William Bull Nelson. When Nelson criticized Davis in front of witnesses, Davis asked for an apology, but Nelson refused. Davis returned with a pistol and shot his superior officer, mortally wounding him. Davis served in the Army of the Cumberland, fighting in the battles of Stone's River and Chickamauga, and now, outside of Atlanta, he took command of the 14th Corps. Schofield made it to Utoy Creek, but Hood had already moved to block the movement. The Confederate cavalry kept Hood abreast of the movement of Union forces. Between August 4th and August 7th, Schofield engaged with Bates' division and others attempting to cross Utoy Creek and get to the railroad. After multiple attempts at frontal assaults against the dug-in Confederates, Schofield attempted to move around the left flank of Bate and used some of the 14th Corps to push the rebels off the field. But Bate held on for as long as he could and then fell back to an even better defensive position. The Union troops would hold their advanced position for the moment, but Sherman still wanted to break the Confederate supply line. The situation for Sherman was becoming dire in some respects. Ulysses S. Grant had become bogged down outside of Richmond and Petersburg, and now he hadn't been able to take Atlanta. Two significant problems arose for Sherman during the campaign as it moved into August. Around 10,000 of his 3-year enlistees were set to be discharged in August, and more later that fall. Even if he could get more troops, they wouldn't be seasoned like his veterans. 2, the Union quartermasters were having trouble keeping up with Sherman's advances, and low river levels prevented a lot of supplies from coming by boat. Sherman soon would run out of men and food if he didn't act quickly. His entrenchments around Atlanta were now 11 miles long, which thinned his ranks and made him susceptible to attack by Hood, who now had the benefit of good interior lines. Hood, hoping to end the stalemate and knowing that his cavalry was fresh off victories during the McCook-Stoneman raid in July, sent his cavalry under Joseph Wheeler to attack Sherman's supply lines. However, Union garrisons along the railroad tracks prevented Wheeler and his men from doing any significant damage. He was able to get 1,000 beef cattle and send them to Atlanta, but that was his only significant accomplishment. Worse, Wheeler took off into East Tennessee, and the Army of Tennessee wouldn't see Wheeler until October. Sherman got word of the absence of Confederate cavalry and planned for his own cavalry to attack the railroads south of Hood's position in Atlanta. On August 20th, Brigadier General Judson Kilpatrick and his cavalry attacked a railroad station below Jonesboro, Georgia, called Lovejoy Station. Kilpatrick was able to chase away the Confederate defenders and destroy some of the Macon and Western Railroad, barely 2 miles worth. Kilpatrick rode to the east to return to Sherman's left and reported he had destroyed 10 miles of track, and it would take at least 10 days to repair the damage. On the day Kilpatrick made his report, Sherman's signalmen witnessed a train chug into Atlanta. This signaled to Sherman that cavalry could not do the necessary damage to the Confederate supply base that a major infantry command could. Sherman decided to use the majority of his force to strike at the rail lines south of Atlanta. He ordered the 20th Corps under Henry Slocum to go north to the Chattahoochee River to guard the crossing there. If his major offensive resulted in disaster, he needed a secure place to fall back, and Slocum would provide that for the rest of the army group. The operation began on August 25th, the same day that delegates to the Democratic National Convention were traveling to Chicago to choose the presidential candidate for the 1864 presidential election. Using the 14th Corps to block the northern approaches and facing the 23rd Corps to the east, he moved his armies from their northern and western positions further south. By August 29th, Sherman's force reached the Atlanta and West Point Railroad and used an entire day to destroy miles of track. This was basically pointless, as the Confederates rarely used that line, and definitely wouldn't when the Union were able to capture it, so this gave Hood an additional day to read the situation. However, he squandered that day, thinking that Sherman's movement was simply him extending his entrenchments, not an offensive operation against his supply. By August 30th, all of Otis Howard's Army of the Tennessee and George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland were well south of Atlanta, with Schofield watching their left flank. John A. Logan's 15th Corps led Howard's army and reached the Flint River, just a half mile from the Macon and Western Railroad. Hood finally realized the threat to the railroad and sent William Hardee and his corps and Stephen D. Lee's corps to Jonesboro to attack and drive back the Union threat. Since Hardee was made commander of the operation and control over both corps, Hardee placed Patrick Cleburne, his most trusted subordinate, as commander of the corps. Cleburne arrived with the corps by the morning of August 31st, with Lee arriving about 3 p.m. Hardee possessed around 20,000 men for this operation. Hardee positioned Cleburne's corps on the left, with Lee on the right. Cleburne was to attack with his entire corps in an echelon attack and push northward, rolling up the Union line. Lee was to move when he heard Cleburne make his attack and swing north with the rest of Cleburne's corps. Cleburne informed his division commanders of Hood's directive to use the bayonets and drive them into the river. Before Cleburne stepped off, Lee, hearing distant gunfire on his left, believed Cleburne was attacking, and that was the signal for him to attack. Lee's troops attacked the 15th Corps of the Army of the Tennessee and got pinned down. They wouldn't go any further, and it was too dangerous to retreat, so they remained on the field under a heavy fire. When Cleburne's men stepped off, Mark P. Lowry, now commanding Cleburne's division, encountered Union cavalry. Instead of brushing them aside and pushing north, Lowry's division went after the horsemen, leaving John C. Brown's division to attack John A. Logan's corps alone. Cleburne rode up to George Maney, whose division was behind Brown, and told him to form on Brown's left and support him. By the time Maney got to Brown's position, Brown's division had already attacked and fallen back. It was a miserable day for the Confederacy. Hardee decided to call off any other attacks and pulled his troops away from the field and guarded the town of Jonesboro. Union troops were already occupying parts of the railroad between Jonesboro and Atlanta, with communication cut between Hardee and Hood. Hood knew he only had one option: evacuation. Hood got a messenger to Hardee to send Lee's corps north to him in Atlanta, and Hardee was to withdraw toward Macon. The Confederate Army of Tennessee was now divided into 3 parts. On September 1st, the Battle of Jonesboro concluded, with Thomas's Army of the Cumberland striking Hardee's corps from the north. Howard's Army of the Tennessee was to attack from the west, but didn't follow through. Still, Thomas's troops broke Hardee's line and sent them southward. The Battle of Jonesboro was over. Communication and supplies were completely cut off from Atlanta, and Atlanta was soon to fall. The battle was incredibly one-sided, especially on the first day. The Union lost just 172 men, as opposed to the Confederacy losing around 2,000. The second day saw Union troops attack an entrenched foe, so the numbers are a little more even, with the Union losing around 1,200 and the Confederacy losing about 1,400 more troops. In all, over the 2 days, the Union suffered nearly 1,400 casualties, while the Confederacy sustained almost 3,400 casualties.